How's it going? Welcome to American 2. Most of y'all are seeing me for the second time, so welcome. Otherwise, welcome for the first time. I'm Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about this semester. Alright, so here's where we're starting about American 2. What I want to do is today kind of give you a precursor, post-cursor, kind of let you know where we are in American history moving forward to start this course. So, kind of the end to American 1 is the Compromise of 1877 that ended Reconstruction. We talked about some of the Native Americans and some of the other stuff that had happened in the late 1800s as the Homestead Act got popular. We talked about a lot of that at the end of American 1. So, what I thought we should do today on our first day here in American 2 is discuss what the country looks like at the start of this course. So there's going to be four main parts of the country. You got the South, you got the North, you got the Midwest, which is what we call the middle of the country. It's not just called the middle, it's because everybody has spread in west, and then they stopped in the middle, so it's like the Midwest. Just a random name, it's really smack dab in the middle. There's nothing Western about it. But the Midwest, and then we're going to start talking about the West Coast. Those things we're going to talk about today to get you a good idea of what is happening in the country as we start this course. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Let me make myself smaller here. Beep, 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 beep. Put myself up here in the corner. So this unit, a lot of this is on the expansion of industry, how America becomes more modern here at the turn of the century, between the 1800s and 1900s. Now, one thing that you need to know for American 2 is the term 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and 21st century. If you hear the term 19th century, that does not mean the 1900s. It's crazy. The 19th century actually means the 1800s, right? Because the first century is year 0 through 100. So whenever we hit year 200, all right, whenever we hit year 100, so from year 100 to 199, that's actually the second century. So century is always one more than the number. So we're going to be talking about the late 19th century, which is the late 1800s. When you get to the 1900s, that's called the 20th century. That's important to understand because you'll see tons of test questions and references and things like that. We are currently in the 21st century. All right. So expansion industry is the end of the 19th century, the 1800s. And we're going to talk about today basically where what is happening in each section of the country at the time, so you have a good basis of what is happening in America at the turn of the century. All right, so let's start out with the North. All right, the North in the United States is really going to be anything really above Virginia. That's what we're going to be talking about when we say the North. The North makes a ton of money for the United States because that is the largest population centers. It is also where most of our stuff gets made at, that we sell all over the world and produces stuff, all right, things, not necessarily food, but stuff for the rest of the country. So the North is the highest populated area, and there's a handful of reasons for that. So by the late 1800s, all right, the late 19th century, transportation had drastically improved. Now today we got airplanes and all types of stuff like that, but back then they didn't have that. You got trains, all right, drastically sped up the ability to move, because prior to trains you had like horse and wagon. Trains drastically sped up the ability to move products around. You got canals, all right. Even though trains are better than canals, the canals still allow things to be shipped all over the country. They created the Erie Canal, which actually connects New York, the state of New York, to the center of the country, which connects to the Great Lakes, which connects to a lot of places like Detroit. So Detroit, which is in Michigan, which is in the center of the country, here, all right. Detroit is right here. You can actually put stuff on a boat and sell it to England from Detroit using the canal system. All right. Because of that, and you know, canals are like man-made rivers. These canal systems are in the north. The train tracks, the majority of the train tracks here are in the north that connect these major cities. So that is one of the reasons that the industrial centers are going to take place in the north, is because they have great transportation. All right. So advancement in transportation is a big reason why the north is going to be more dominant in industry. So this is a lot of what the north is going to look like at the time. Today, understanding the environmental impacts that humans can have, we look at this and just seems horrible. At the time, there's no concept that you could possibly influence like the climate by doing stuff. So nobody thought about it. They just dump stuff in rivers and all this. Over time, we realized that's not good, and we've changed it. But in the late 1800s, this is what cities would look like. Just absolutely, it's dark, it's dingy. Even though this is a black and white picture, it wouldn't look a whole lot better if it was in color. Now, the cities were intensely packed in with people. People come from all over to work in horrible, vicious, brutal conditions. And you're like, who in the world in their right mind would go and work in awful conditions? A lot of people. A lot of people. And here's who. So keep in mind, in the north is mainly industry. Tons of people. This is a photograph from the time. Probably around the turn of the century. If you notice that factory workers, people that work here of all ages, sexes, and races in the north, meaning women, all right? Women could go work in the factories. If a woman had a husband killed in the Civil War, all right, or wasn't married, there are very few ways of women to be able to make a living. Factories, while they did pay women less, they absolutely did pay women less, it was a way for a woman to get a job and be able to provide for herself. There was not a lot of options for women, so factories did employ women. Also, freed slaves, right? African Americans met massive discrimination, massive amounts of racism in the United States at the time, even in the North. But factory jobs were available to African Americans, so you're going to see black people, women, all types of people flood to these factories, especially immigrants. Immigrants coming into this country desperately looking for a new life. It's called the American Dream, right? And we'll reference it quite a bit in this course. The American Dream is an idea. This idea that if you work hard enough, you can have anything that you want in America. And it is a huge selling point of America. This idea of freedom, that you're not confined to a social class. You can come over here and you can work up, and you don't have to be born into nobility and things like that had been taking place in Europe for quite some time. That wasn't supposed to exist in America. So the American Dream is the idea that you can show up, work hard, and move up the social ladder and be as rich as you wanted to be. And we'll talk more about that in the future. But that idea of the American Dream is really what draws a bunch of immigrants into the United States at the time, coming in from Europe. The vast majority of factory workers in the North will be immigrants. Factory work is not very safe. It's not very fun, and it's not very enjoyable. Use this picture here as an example. So the United States government at the time, just hands off. Laissez-faire. Just, don't care. Not our responsibility. The United States government's mentality at the time, at the turn of the century, is that the government's job is basically to tax and defend the American population. They deal with other countries. If somebody tries to invade us, the government, has a federal military. They'll show up and they'll stop it. That was about it. All right. And so the laissez-faire is very much hands-off. They're like, oh, it's a business? Who cares? Y'all go make $1 gazillion. Now, in theory, that sounds great, right? And a lot of people love that idea because, the government's not going to come over and, shut down your business. They're not going to do all this other stuff. So what we're going to figure out in the late 1800s is the fact that that's not necessarily a good thing. If you let people run society, that sounds all great and fair as long as everybody's equal. That's the logic of laissez-faire of the government itself. Just let everybody figure it out for themselves. Let the best be successful. Work your way up. That is under the idea that everybody has the option to be able to work up. What we're going to see, and we're going to talk about it in this unit, is there's a very small group of really rich guys that will end up shutting down the entire government. The entire country. Economically, they'll be the richest people you've ever heard of. But they will end up preventing anybody else from becoming rich. And that's when the federal government realizes there's an issue with this laissez-faire. But at this time period, and when we're starting this course, the government doesn't have any involvement in society at the time, in the businesses, and is indicative of child labor, very commonly used. You wanted kids to work in your factories. You know why? Because these big dangerous machines that have something that's stuck, you send the kid in with the little arms and little legs that can reach stuff. Extremely dangerous. Kids got paid less, but hey, they can show up and work. Who cares? Who needs school? All right, pay this kid $0.05 a day. Happy as can be. So the wages were so low in the factories that for a family to survive, in order for families to survive at the time, everybody had to work. Just enough to be able to provide bread to survive that day. And the reason that these factories, even if they had money, didn't pay more is if you asked for more money, there's an immigrant outside that just got here that is more than happy to take your job and work for less. So we're going to talk about that dynamic more as we move through in this unit. So the North, factories, tons of people are there. It is an opportunity, but the ability once you get there to move up is very, very limited. And it's very dangerous work as there is no government regulation of anything. There's no oversight of anything in the factories. All right, moving on from the North, let's go to the South. See what's happening in the South. Wow, that looks an awful lot like slavery. It does look a lot like slavery. Slavery is over. There is no more slavery. 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment gave African Americans equal rights. 15th Amendment gave black people the right to vote. However, kind of surprising, the lifestyle for many African Americans doesn't change at all in the South. Almost all the African Americans that remain in the South after the Civil War, after the end of slavery, live a very similar lifestyle to slavery, as in they work day in and day out harvesting cotton. All right? Because there's this concept called sharecropping, in which if you don't have any money, which freed slaves did not, you could work somebody else's land for a small percentage of the crops, for a very small percentage of the money that you then had to turn around and spend to survive, and typically it puts you in debt. You borrowed from whoever's land you were working on. It puts you in a cycle of debt. Very, very hard to get out of. So the sharecropping system was a perpetual machine that kept you in debt and working for other people. Now, a couple of things I need to clarify about that, because all that is true, that very few freed slaves were able to excel, and most were stuck in this constant thing of sharecropping. Number one, sharecropping is way better than slavery because you're not owned by another person. As we have talked about previously, the horrors of slavery is the fact that you don't exist and can't make your own decisions. Sharecropping is better than that. People at least choose to be a sharecropper. So it is better. There's few things imaginable other than death that would be worse than slavery, in which your existence doesn't really matter. So I want to put that, even though the work is basically the same and it's brutal work and you're not gaining anything out of it really as a sharecropper, you still can decide who to marry, where to go be a sharecropper at. It is better than slavery. I do want to put that out there. And another thing I need to put out, there's a ton of poor white people in the South too. Tons of poor white people in the South. Poor white people in the South are also sharecroppers. All right? So the vast majority of poor people in the South are sharecroppers, and they're doing the same job as freed slaves. That's actually where the racism is going to be the most prevalent. So when there was slavery, that's a class system. You had your slaves, you had your poor whites, and then you had your rich people. Well, now all of a sudden you've taken away the entire class of slaves, and now you just have poor people. So how do poor white people differentiate themselves from the other poor people? They're like, oh, because you're a different color than me, you're inferior. That is the logic that comes out, which is not logical, but racism doesn't follow logic. So once you lifted the concept of slavery in the South, you're going to have extreme racism, all right, as a way for the poor whites in the South to basically still feel they have a middle position in society. That is where the origins of the extreme racism are going to come out, when you're going to see the lynchings and things like that. These entire motivation of states in the South to keep black people in an inferior position through racism. And we'll talk about that, especially as we get up into the 1950s and we talk about the civil rights movement, when a whole lot we're going to talk about that in this course. But at the time, most black people there in the South are still sharecroppers, and nothing has really changed in the South. The South's main export is still cotton. Very little has changed in the South. All right. So the North is industrialized. The South, sharecropping. People are still growing food. People are still growing cotton in the South. Very little has changed in the South, and very little is going to change in the South for a while. So let's move out to the Midwest, which is really the mid. It's just called the Midwest. So the middle of the country. All right. So the Midwest, a lot of people moved out here because of the Homestead Act, which gave land away, 160 acres, to anybody that wanted to move out here, African Americans as well. They were called exodusters. Anybody that wanted to move out to the middle of the country, you could have 160 acres of land. The only catch is that you had to live on it. You had to make a house on it and grow food on it for like 5 years before it actually became yours. All right. And then you got to own it. Well, when you move out to the middle of the Great Plains, which is just wide open, there's not trees. So what they would live in is, these are called soddies. All right. This is really a house made out of dirt. There just aren't trees. So a lot of what the homesteaders had to live on in the middle of the country is they would build these like dirt houses. I assume there's some type of clay of baking it, so where it makes it more brick-like. I would guess. I can't imagine just like a dirt house, but it's called a soddie from sod. It's dirt. So maybe it is. I mean, look, they got like growing grass on the roof. So I've never actually been in a soddie. I'm not exactly sure how dirt like it is, but it probably is. So the middle of the country is really just farmers. Now, this is new because in the middle of the country, which ends up being a massive location for where we grow the majority of the food for the United States up to present day, previously nobody had farmed out there, mainly because there is a water issue. So it's not that there's a shortage of rainfall. It's just the rain is inconsistent. Sometimes it'll go really long times without raining and all your crops will die. Sometimes it'll rain so hard it would flood. It's bad. So the Native Americans never farmed in the middle of the country because there's inconsistent rainfall. Well, once the Americans move out there, and we talked about the brutal way they stole this land in American One, is stuff like the windmill, which pumps water out of the ground and allows for irrigation. Stuff like the steel plow created by John Deere. These type of innovations allow the homesteaders to be very successful in the middle of the country, and they're mass producing a lot of the food in the United States at the time. So that's really what's happening in the middle of the country. We had talked about the Homestead Act, Moral Land Grant Act, Dawes Act previously. So just understanding in the middle of the country, a lot of people growing food that have taken advantage of the Homestead Act. So let's go to the West. So again, North industrialized, the South, ain't much changed. Middle of the country, you have a whole bunch of farmers, all right, that are producing food for the United States. Then the West. The West got populated. California is what we're talking about, the real West with the Pacific Ocean, got populated with the gold rush. Well, once a lot of people started going over for the gold rush, a lot of immigrants started coming in to California as well, namely the Chinese that were coming across the Pacific Ocean. So the Chinese, they came over during the gold rush, and then the United States let a lot of immigrants in when it was time to build that transcontinental railroad, because they're like, hey, if they can build a Great Wall of China, I bet they can build a railroad. However, as we start this course, the gold's gone, the transcontinental railroad is complete, and you still have these immigrants coming in from China. And the Chinese have a different language, a different culture, a different religion, very different from America. All right? From your typical American. Keep in mind, America is incredibly racist to African Americans who have a different skin color, and they're extremely discriminatory in the North to the Irish that we'll talk more about because they're Catholic, a different version of Christianity. If America is hateful to those people with those small differences, imagine having an entire different race, culture, language, religion. It's just a lot of pointing back different. There's no justification for our negativity. But economically, the argument is, and this is a little bit more logical than just straight up racism of the dislike of Chinese, there's just not a lot of jobs on the West Coast. But the Chinese immigrants, because that flow of immigrants from China had been started, it is really difficult to stop the Chinese from coming into the West Coast. So there's going to be a huge backlash to the Chinese coming in the United States from California, from China after this. So that is basically what the West is dealing with. So the West is dealing with immigration from China that they don't want. The middle of the country, getting used to growing food for everybody. The North is all industrialized, and that is the main hub of all immigrants that are coming from Europe, like from Ireland and things. That is where they're showing up at. And the South ain't changing at all. All right, so that's as far as we're going to get today on this initial lesson. This is a lot shorter than most days will be, but I wanted to get caught up and understand how this is going to work. As always, as those questions that you go through, hopefully you are doing this. Pause me when you get to a question so you can answer the questions in 2 complete sentences, and then unpause me and go on. All your questions must have 2 complete sentences. If you turn in an assignment with just 1 sentence, you don't get half credit for that question. You don't get any credit for it. It has to be 2 complete sentences. I know 1 sentence is ended and another one is beginning because it has a period on it. 2 complete sentences. All right. So I will see you guys tomorrow.